In 1986, a Japanese Airlines airplane, Boeing 747, was en route from Paris to Tokyo. As it flew over Alaska, Captain Kenju Tairoshi noticed strange moving lights directly ahead. Suddenly, an unidentified object headed towards the airplane. What the captain initially took for a fighter jet turned out to be a round object, twice the size of the Airbus. This case remains unexplained to this day. On the 24th of June 1947, American pilot Kenneth Arnold saw 9 unidentified flying objects over Mount Rainier in the state of Washington. The pilot assumed that they were Russian planes and immediately reported a possible attack to the FBI. In December of the same year, due to the increasing reports of UFO sightings, the government officially tasked the Air Force with investigating the phenomenon of mysterious flying saucers. However, the investigation was not only handled by the military, security services also showed interest. FBI Chief John Edgar Hoover and Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, who headed the newly formed CIA, also became interested in the flying objects. However, the public learned about their role in the investigation of the UFO phenomenon only 30 years later, when the Freedom of Information Act was passed. For many years, all government agencies in the United States claimed that UFO research was conducted solely by the Air Force, but it is now known that this was not the case. Information about contacts with UFOs was disseminated across all branches of the U.S. military institutions. Access to these documents was granted to the Air Force, Army, and Navy. The CIA became interested in UFOs in 1948, and the agency meticulously studied eyewitness accounts from around the world, keeping very detailed reports in its archives. No less important documents were also sent to the FBI, starting not from 1947, but even earlier. These reports were transmitted to other government agencies, and the most important information reached directly to the White House. Ordinary Americans would not have learned about this if not for the advent of the era of press freedom. In 1974, amendments to the Freedom of Information Act were passed in the United States, and the subsequent 10 years can confidently be called a golden age of informational freedom. During this time, UFO researchers found it relatively easy to gain access to important secret documents. President Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s contributed to the fact that the Freedom of Information Act was interpreted quite liberally, allowing anyone who wished to request information, and government officials were obliged to quickly locate the documents of interest. By the mid-1980s, such freedom was no longer observed, but for a decade, American UFO researchers could freely obtain thousands of important documents from the CIA, FBI, Air Force, Navy, and other organizations investigating the UFO phenomenon. The National Security Agency, sometimes referred to as the agency that does not exist, showed immense interest in UFOs. One of the reports stored in its archive was obtained in 1953, just a couple of months after the agency's creation, although its leaders have always claimed that they are not interested in UFO issues. In the 1970s, the United States government, according to the Freedom of Information Act, allowed access to thousands of pages of secret materials related to information about UFOs. The CIA, FBI, and other institutions provided their documents to anyone interested. Interestingly, before the amendments to the law were adopted, these organizations had denied the existence of reports on the study of unidentified flying objects in their archives for many years. Many documents were classified as top secret. To this day, the most secret materials in the interest of national security remain hidden from the public. National security issues often require strict documentation rules. However, there is an opinion that government structures used these rules to conceal important information from the general public. Some experts believe that the available documents did not contain key information. CIA employees can confirm that the most important information is not even put in writing. Much of what interests researchers remains a mystery, but access to some documents was still obtained. This provided an opportunity to understand that the government was indeed dealing with the issue of unidentified flying objects. In the FBI archives, there is a document dated 1949, which states that the issue of flying saucers is classified as ultra-secret. The military, including the Air Force, Army, and Navy, also considered this information extremely important. The National Security Agency appeared before the Supreme Court in 1982 when officials were asked to explain why they refused to disclose a number of documents. The agency outlined its reasons on 21 pages and read them under oath, asserting that these documents are classified as top secret. It is important to understand that the designation top secret means that the disclosure of such information without special permission could lead to serious violations of public order and national security. If materials concerning the UFO phenomenon are considered top secret, then the significance of the issue becomes apparent. One of the researchers who had the opportunity to review this document stated that it does not mention findings of alien bodies or contacts between the American government and extraterrestrials. If such information is indeed stored in top-secret archives, it is unlikely that it would be considered in the Supreme Court of the United States. According to the documents, the CIA initially believed that UFOs were merely rumors spread by people wishing to calm the public. However, in July 1952, an incident occurred that prompted security agencies to reconsider their stance. On the 19th and 26th of July, unidentified flying objects appeared on the radars of the National Airport in Washington, freely hovering over the White House and the Pentagon, despite strict prohibitions against entering the airspace of these buildings. F-94 interceptor jets were scrambled, but they were unable to catch up with the rapidly moving objects. The situation in the air was spiraling out of control, while the telephone lines of the American capital were paralyzed by calls from concerned citizens. Military representatives were unable to provide a coherent explanation, stating that the events were related to atmospheric changes due to fluctuations in air temperature. The CIA realized that this case could lead to a national crisis. If an enemy wanted to paralyze the rapid response system in emergency conditions, they could not have found a better way. As a result, CIA leaders decided to convene a meeting to discuss the flying saucer problem. This meeting, held in January 1953, was named the Robertson Panel. The decisions made during this discussion defined the entire subsequent history of UFO phenomenon research. The Robertson Panel became a significant milestone in the history of UFO studies, and many do not realize the fateful importance of its work. In 1952, a wave of UFOs appearing in the skies over the United States reached its peak, and people observed numerous unidentified flying objects of various shapes. In July 1952, the United States Air Force held a press conference during which military officials assured the public that the observed phenomena were nothing more than natural occurrences caused by temperature fluctuations. Although such an explanation satisfied many ordinary citizens, experts and knowledgeable individuals understood that this interpretation of UFOs did not withstand scrutiny. In January 1953, as Harry Truman's presidential term was coming to an end, the CIA initiated an invitation for scientists to study the UFO phenomenon. At the head of the commission, named after the renowned theoretical physicist from the University of California, Robertson was indeed he. It later became known that the Commission's conclusions were prepared even before the analysis of documents began. The Commission convened at the end of the last week of Truman's presidential term. Robertson's conclusions stated that UFOs were not a secret phenomenon and did not pose a threat to national security, nor did they relate to extraterrestrial technologies. The scientists recommended that the government inform the public about the true nature of UFOs, explaining them as a natural phenomenon. Following the work of the Commission, interest in UFOs was shown not only by the FBI and the CIA, but also by the National Security Agency, especially during periods of unstable political situations, such as during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. This raised questions. Did these agencies really believe that UFOs could be used to destabilize opponents and seize power? And did they know something about the UFO phenomenon that remained unknown to the general public? Unfortunately, the documents that became available do not provide answers to these questions. From 1952 to 1969, the study of UFOs was codenamed Project Blue Book. It is now known that some unidentified flying objects were actually reconnaissance aircraft operated by the CIA. This raises the question, was the government attempting to conceal the existence of these aircraft from citizens? From the thousands of documents available to the public, it becomes clear that security agencies did not even attempt to conduct serious investigations into the true nature of UFOs. Many are convinced that the American and Canadian governments, the CIA, the FBI, and other entities pretend not to be interested in the UFO phenomenon, while in reality, they are secretly studying it. While this may be true, it is impossible to prove. It is hard not to notice that the authorities do not actually show interest in this issue. The government receives information on such issues from research centers, while scientists try to speak as little as possible about UFOs. They do not have enough reliable information for serious conclusions. Personally, I have not found any evidence that any serious scientific organization, including American ones, is studying the UFO phenomenon. In the United States, there is another organization that has repeatedly encountered UFOs, NASA. Some believe that almost all American spacecraft have encountered alien vessels, although NASA is unlikely to state this openly. In September 1991, during the flight of the Space Shuttle Discovery as part of the ATS-48 program, astronauts recorded an unidentified flying object on film. The analysis of the recordings was entrusted to physics professor Jack Cashier from the University of Nebraska. The Discovery was flying over Australia, and the video cameras were running continuously. The astronauts were observing the night sky when suddenly a bright light appeared to the right of their course. There were several of them, but one stood out in size. Suddenly, this object separated from the group of lights and began to move slowly to the left. Then it stopped and two bright flashes appeared in the lower left corner of the screen. The objects, likely responding to this signal, suddenly moved to the right. A few seconds later, the camera captured two streaks that ran across the sky. One of them passed nearby while the other was a bit further away. Another object was also moving to the left but reacted to the flash with a quick movement. The objects on the right acted instantly. The astronauts observed the glowing objects and recorded the two flashes. The reaction of these objects was noticeable when the flashes and streaks flew to the place where the objects had previously been. NASA explained what happened by stating that such phenomena occur in outer space. According to their statement, these objects were merely ice particles that flew close to the spacecraft. It is possible that the spacecraft was simply passing by an ice formation, and the ice chunks got caught in the exhaust plume of the rocket, causing them to be carried away over a long distance. Such cases do indeed happen. However, one of the researchers who studied the recording came to a different conclusion. He noted, "I studied the recording, compared the course of the spacecraft and the objects, taking into account the spatial and temporal coordinates. Then I plotted a graph, studied the reaction of the objects and their movements from a scientific perspective. And he came to the conclusion that these lights could not have been ice chunks. This video recording is not the only visual evidence of the existence of mysterious glowing objects that NASA possesses. There are countless of them. The first recordings appeared back in the early 60s when the Mercury program was launched. In July 1969, a day before the first landing on the moon, the crew of the Apollo 11 spacecraft recorded two unusual lights on film, which were considered on Earth to be reflections on the windows of the lunar module. The researcher adds, I cannot say with complete certainty that in this case the information was deliberately concealed. I suspect that NASA is studying UFOs, and if they were indeed investigating this phenomenon, they naturally would not want to disclose this information. He claims that UFOs represent an interesting object for study and that the government is hiding the truth about UFOs. The authorities undoubtedly possess secret documents containing reports of contacts with UFOs. They also do the same at NASA. The researcher does not know who specifically ordered to classify the information about the STS-48 mission, but he is confident in the results of his research. I can confidently say that this spacecraft encountered some kind of cosmic object, not ice chunks. He has communicated with many astronauts, most of whom have never seen a UFO. When they are attributed things they did not say, the astronauts are very unhappy about it. Of course, there are also quite a few unexplained reports, such as the case of James McDivitt. He recounted how he encountered a mysterious object during a flight on the Gemini spacecraft. Other astronauts who observed unusual phenomena in space also wrote about this in their reports. Some of these cases have found their explanation. The researcher shares his experience. I saw with my own eyes a trail of waste discharge with burning fuel behind the spacecraft, so I cannot believe the explanation given by NASA. If an ice chunk enters this trail, it looks completely different. He emphasizes that if astronauts indeed encountered a UFO, then NASA, of course, would not shout about it from the rooftops. Ice chunks do not look like UFOs and behave completely differently. NASA provided the public with a number of documents that did not have the classification top secret. This information can be found in the book published on this occasion or in his first monograph, which he titled Absolutely Not Secret. It investigates the phenomenon of UFOs, that is obvious. They have access to a wealth of confidential information, both publicly available and top secret. I know this for a fact. I am sure that NASA keeps a lot of secret materials about UFOs. Unlike the United States, in Canada, the government did not commission security agencies to investigate the phenomenon of UFOs. In the early 50s, on the personal initiative of engineer Wilbert Smith from the Canadian Department of Transport, the only research effort known as Project Magnet was undertaken. With the support of his superiors, Smith began to study all reports of sightings of unidentified objects that were available to the Department of National Security and the Department of Transport. Smith was looking for reliable scientific information in these reports. In 1952, his interest in the UFO problem led to serious research. During a visit to Washington, with the help of the Canadian Embassy, he met with Dr. Robert Sarbacher, a well-known expert in missile control systems. Sarbacher informed him that UFOs in the United States were considered a top-secret subject. Wilbert Smith also established cooperation with Donald Keyhoe, who later organized his own investigation. Smith managed to gain government support for the creation of Project Magnet, within which researchers were to use scientific equipment to measure the frequency of UFO appearances in the sky. Fluctuations in the electromagnetic field were supposed to indicate the appearance of unidentified objects. However, despite some success, the project was closed in the early 50s. The reasons remained unclear. Either the Canadian government showed no interest or did not wish to invest funds in this project. The closure of Project Magnet occurred under the same circumstances as the American Project Blue Book, which exposed government agencies hiding important information about UFOs. Smith did not hide his confidence that UFOs were spacecraft of extraterrestrials. However, fearing that he would make his discoveries public, in 1954, the Department of Transport withdrew its support and advised him to cease work on the project. Smith halted his research and made his findings public, concluding that UFOs had an obvious extraterrestrial origin. Parallel to Smith's work, a committee supported by the Department of Transport and the Department of National Defense was engaged in investigating the phenomenon of UFOs. Their conclusions turned out to be more favorable for the government. After these initiatives, no one in Canada made further attempts to explain UFO phenomena. The Department of Transportation refused to continue research, and the Department of National Defense saw no point in further collecting eyewitness accounts. In 1967, the results of the research were transferred to the Hertzberg Institute in Ottawa, part of the National Research Council, (EM). However, the Institute's interest in eyewitness accounts had nothing to do with UFOs. The Institute conducted research on geophysical phenomena, particularly astronomical ones. Some scientists, notably Dr. Peter Millman, believed that observing meteors could help detect celestial bodies that had fallen to Earth. He approached the police with a request to report all unusual lights in the sky, even if they were considered unidentified flying objects. Information from the police was sent to the Research Institute, where the reports were studied to determine what exactly the witnesses had seen. If it was ball lightning or a meteorite, a group of geophysicists from the Hertzberg Institute was immediately dispatched, as meteorites held significant scientific value for the scientists. If the object did not pertain to meteors, it was classified as a non-meteorological object. Each year, a small folder of documents accumulated at the Hertzberg Institute, consisting of 20 to 30 pages. The testimonies of people who saw something more mysterious in the sky than meteors attracted the attention of the National Research Council. Scientists hoped that these reports would help them gather information about meteorites, which is why they sought to obtain as many eyewitness accounts as possible. Over the years, the folder containing reports of UFO sightings grew thicker, and from time to time, some of the documents were transferred to the National Archives of Canada. These files, containing reports of sightings, are still available for reading today, preserved in the archive. Information about UFOs primarily came from police departments, both federal and municipal. When citizens of Canada contacted the police to report UFO sightings, a patrol car would be dispatched to the scene. Police officers often perceived such reports as a joke, but despite this, they were obligated to respond to such claims, which created additional paperwork, as they needed to file a report. Nevertheless, there were cases when the police themselves became witnesses to unusual phenomena. For example, 5 or 6 years ago in Saint-Hyacinthe, as well as in Quebec, in Cochrane, and in many other cities, people were becoming witnesses to the phenomenon much more often than one might think, although not everyone was willing to talk about it. On the 7th of November 1990, dozens of people, including local police officers, observed a glowing object hovering above the Bonaventure Hotel in Montreal. The round object, surrounded by a golden glow, remained motionless for several hours until it was obscured by clouds. 2 years later, Richard Haynes, a leading scientist at NASA Ames Research Center, concluded that it was a physical phenomenon, not a reflection of light or the northern lights. In his report, he indicated that the object was at an altitude of between 1 and 3 kilometers and analyzed a photograph taken by local journalist Marcel Laroche, as well as considered the weather conditions of that day. His conclusions were impressive. The length of the unidentified flying object was about 535 meters, which can be compared to the size of approximately 5 football fields. This incident still remains unexplained, and UFOs above the Bonaventure Hotel were observed by several police officers. It is interesting how police document such incidents. If a report is received about the observation of an unusual object in the sky or that an unidentified object has landed on water or land, they open a case and begin to gather information. Operators send a patrol car to the scene of the incident to conduct an investigation. The police become the eyes and ears of the investigation. The investigator writes an official report and forwards it to the operator or directly to the responsible person. They rely on the professional experience of the officers who examine the scene and prepare documentation. The investigator interviews witnesses and compiles inventories of discovered physical evidence. Based on this data, They draw their conclusions, collecting and systematizing the information. After reviewing the provided data, the investigative authorities make a decision on further actions. Sometimes forensic experts are sent to the scene, and if everything indicates that people indeed observed a UFO, additional measures are taken to restrict civilian access to that area, and a team of investigators is dispatched to the scene. If the unidentified object may pose a threat to national security, the police are obligated to report the incident to the authorities. When an unidentified flying object was discovered over the Bonaventure Hotel, information about it was immediately sent to the Air Force. However, the object was not detected by radar, and the officers at the Trenton Military Base in Ontario, responsible for security in eastern Canada, did not deem it necessary to scramble fighter jets. Had they acted differently, events could have unfolded according to a completely different scenario. In cases where it seems that a statement lacks basis, information is not passed on to the armed forces or federal police. They already have enough cases, and we do not have time for pointless work either. If eyewitness accounts are corroborated, then the information is passed on to the Bureau of Territorial Oversight, which works closely with the Canadian Armed Forces and the National Police. If there is confidence that the case warrants further investigation and pertains to national security, the Bureau of Territorial Oversight immediately reports this to the National Police or the Canadian Armed Forces. One of the agency representatives emphasizes, "I do not wish to disappoint those who see something important in the UFO phenomenon, but unidentified flying objects are not studied by either the police or the military." The military's task is to protect the country, while the police are obliged to maintain public order. By the rules, UFOs do not pose any real danger. For a more productive study of the UFO phenomenon, experts believe it is worth creating an independent national committee that would have no ties to military structures, but whose members would have the right to conduct investigations similar to those carried out by the police. The goal of such a committee would be not only to protect the territory of Canada, but also to study UFOs. Some may consider this impossible, but such an organization does indeed exist. It is SEPRA, the French Service for the Investigation of Phenomena Caused by the Penetration of External Objects into the Atmosphere. The National Center for Space Studies has a civilian division that deals with the study of airspace, including satellites and rockets that enter the atmosphere over France. In 1977, during an interview with Minister Robert Galley, a journalist inquired about what the government was doing in relation to the appearance of strange objects in the sky after the war, known as UFOs. The minister acknowledged that numerous reports from witnesses of unusual phenomena were coming into the police. In response to this, the government of France planned to study this phenomenon from a scientific perspective, rather than just through newspaper headlines. The Center for Space Research was tasked with creating a committee, which was named Japan, the Group for the Study of Unidentified Aerospace Phenomena. Within Japan, there existed a scientific council, and the research methods were scientifically justified. It was from a scientific standpoint that the ways of collecting and analyzing information were determined in order to draw reasoned conclusions about the mysterious phenomenon of UFOs. Since the establishment of Japan in 1977, all civil and military organizations have entered into an agreement to divide responsibilities. Now, French police officers and Air Force pilots are required to report information if they encounter something unexplained. They report this to the police, and the police pass the information to SEPRA. SEPRA analyzes the data and provides an expert assessment of the events that occurred. This scheme has been functioning since 1977. All incoming information is stored in a database, and each eyewitness account is entered into a computer. Today there are about 6,000 of them, which represents quite an impressive volume of information. Thanks to this, SEPRA can analyze the testimonies received from witnesses over the last 50 years. Our organization receives information from all institutions related to the study of unidentified flying objects. By entering into a cooperation agreement, we ensured that every police officer knows how to act upon receiving a report from a UFO witness. If someone reports seeing an object in the sky, the police officer prepares a report, which then comes to us. In the event that something unusual occurs, especially if physical evidence remains at the scene, such as traces on the ground, the police promptly contacts us. We go to the site with equipment that neither the police nor the military possess, as their duties do not include scientific research of the UFO phenomenon. This is the responsibility of the Center for Space Research. On the 8th of January 1981, in the French town of Aix-en-Provence, a man, while working in his garden, noticed a glowing oval object that descended from the sky and landed in a field next to his house. According to him, the object was made of polished metal and was about the size of a small car. There were no identifying marks on its surface. The object was on the ground for only a few seconds, then silently ascended into the air and disappeared. The incident report notes that a round mark with a diameter of about 2 meters remained at the landing site. A man called the police, who in turn contacted CIPRA, as our center was then called. The analysis results showed that there were anomalies in the soil and vegetation that scientists had not encountered before. However, it is not always possible to obtain information firsthand, which complicates the explanation of what the person actually saw. Even when we receive testimony from an eyewitness, it usually occurs after some time, and part of the information is lost, making our conclusion subjective. We strive to understand what happened and provide some explanation for it. On a global scale, about 12% of reports received since 1950 remain unexplained. These testimonies concern various UFOs with unusual appearances and technological characteristics unknown to science. For example, some objects move across the sky in a zigzag trajectory or fly silently, and when approaching an eyewitness's car, its engine stalls. There are also cases where people have observed an unusual object hovering a few meters above the ground, which then suddenly disappeared. On the 28th of January 1994, a French Airlines Airbus was at an altitude of 12,000 meters when the pilots unexpectedly noticed a large red disc flying along the left side at a distance of about 46 kilometers. The object was visible for only a few seconds, then changed shape and disappeared. Operators at the Airspace Protection Center, monitoring radar readings, confirmed that an unidentified flying object indeed appeared on the screen, crossing the trajectory of the Airbus before disappearing from the screens. Although this may seem strange, such encounters between airplanes and UFOs are not isolated incidents. Every year, the agencies responsible for flight safety face similar occurrences, most of which are monitored by the International Civil Aviation Organization. These unexplained encounters in the sky rarely make it to the newspaper pages. However, in many cases, they concern passenger safety. On the 9th of August 1997, a Swiss Airlines Boeing 737 en route from New York to Philadelphia nearly collided with an unidentified flying object. On the 6th of January 1995, just minutes before landing at Manchester Airport, a British Airways Boeing 737 nearly collided with a bright triangular object. This unidentified flying object moved silently, and its presence was not detected by radars. In August 1984, a plane from the airline Condair collided with a UFO and was forced to make an emergency landing in Ipswich. The report from inspectors of British and civil aviation indicated that the aircraft sustained serious damage to one of its engines. Damage was inflicted on a part of the fuselage, one of the ailerons, and a hydraulic cable. Neither the civil aviation investigators nor the head of CEPRA, Jean-Jacques Velasco, could provide a coherent explanation for any of these incidents. According to him, these are phenomena that cannot be associated with technologies available today. If nothing similar exists on Earth, then these technologies must have been invented somewhere else. Velasco suggested that UFOs might be coming from space, although he noted that it is impossible to speak about this with complete certainty. Scientists can only start from this theory. France is the only country in the world where the National Committee for Space Research has established a service for the study of UFOs. This service was founded in 1977 by engineer Claude Poher, who once led it and is now retired. Claude became interested in the UFO phenomenon after reading the Condon Report. He noted that if a phenomenon is described in thousands of pages, and then it is claimed that it cannot exist in nature, then it truly deserves close examination. Claude began extensive research that lasted many years. In the early 1980s, Japan was transformed into SEPRA, as the UFO Research Center ceased to consider it a top priority. For 80 years, they were more interested in other issues. Claude Poher emphasizes that in France, the scientific community has taken on the challenge of addressing this complex task, which requires open dialogue with the public. The founders of the service, such as Japan, Claude Poher, and Elaine Esterlo, achieved significant success in the early years of its existence. However, recently SEPRA has faced difficulties and cannot operate as it once did. They do not have the capacity to disclose a large volume of information as they did before. Their main task is to study atmospheric phenomena, and although they also deal with the UFO phenomenon, they have virtually no time or resources left for serious research. In such conditions, it is impossible to speak of a clear system of scientific work. Between SEPRA and independent UFO researchers, there has long been a debate about who better understands the subject of study. Poher and Elaine responded to such statements. "We are working on this issue. We do not have time to respond to letters and phone calls. Over time, you will learn about the results of our work." As a result, independent researchers began to suspect SEPRA of concealing the truth about their research, but that is not the case. The problems concern something entirely different. For scientists, the UFO phenomenon is not a priority research object, unlike independent researchers who dedicate their entire lives to it. Moreover, the National Center for Space Studies has never considered SEPRA's work a priority direction of its activities, and therefore, they cannot boast of significant funding. This service continues to operate, but their capabilities are not limitless. Since Japan was transformed into SEPRA, they have not presented a single new report. Often, the work does not go beyond discussions, as it was in 1981 when an unidentified object was recorded landing in Aix-en-Provence. This case was investigated by Japan. It still sparks discussions, but since then nothing has changed in the original investigation. After the Second World War, several civilian services encountered the UFO phenomenon. The number of unexplained eyewitness accounts is growing every day, despite the fact that there are still many documents classified as top secret. In recent years, the public has gained access to thousands of documents confirming that the UFO phenomenon does indeed exist and requires study. Society and the media, skeptics, and UFO researchers continue to discuss theories about aliens from space. This discussion could be more productive if we approach the study of facts without bias. After all, one cannot take away from people the belief in what they want to believe. In our next episode of the UFO investigation program, we will continue the conversation about the mysterious UFO phenomenon and try to look into our future. The program is duplicated at the Tootie Records studio at the request of the U7 TV studio. Not a step back nor half a step forward.